By autumn, orders came down. Many POWs would soon be repatriated to Europe. The announcement was met with mixed emotions. Joy at the thought of home. Fear at what home now meant. Hans spent his last few evenings sitting near the fence, watching the sunset glow red against the corn. Bauer joined him one evening, passing a flask of coffee through the wire. "So," Bauer said, "you'll be leaving soon." Hans nodded. "You'll rebuild," the farmer said. "Your country needs people who've seen both sides." Hans smiled faintly. "I'm not sure they'll listen." Bauer looked at him. "Then speak anyway." That night, Hans wrote one final entry in his diary. "We came here thinking we were the master race. We leave knowing we were students." He didn't know what awaited him in Germany. Ruins, hunger, maybe nothing at all. But one truth burned clear. The war had been lost long before the guns fell silent. It had been lost the moment men stopped seeing humanity in their enemies. The next morning, the convoy rolled out. Hans turned to see Bauer's farm one last time. The red barn, the waving children, the field he had helped plow. A world that wasn't his, but somehow had become part of him. The truck rumbled away, the camp shrinking behind him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt free. But what happens when men who've seen two worlds return to one in ruins? What can they rebuild when everything they believed in is turned to ash? That question would define the rest of their lives and shape the future of a divided Germany. The ship rocked gently as it crossed the Atlantic. 1946. The war was long over, but for the men on board, it still lived behind their eyes. Hans Richter leaned against the railing, staring at the endless gray water. Somewhere ahead lay Germany, or what was left of it. The last time he'd seen his homeland, it had stretched proud and unbroken. Now it was a scar. When the docks of Bremerhaven came into view, silence fell. Cities once boasting cathedrals and beer gardens were flattened into stone fields. Smoke still hung over the ruins like fog that refused to leave. Children wandered in rags. Mothers traded bread for coal. And in every face, the same question, what do we do? The Americans released them with papers stamped "Return POW." No speeches, no lecturas. Just a warning. Do something good with what you've learned. Hans walked through Munich and hardly recognized it. His family's home was gone, a blackened skeleton among others. In a makeshift camp, he finally found his mother, thinner, gray, but alive. When she saw him, she wept silently, running her hand across the rough fabric of his coat, as if confirming he was real. They spoke little that first night. Words felt useless. Only later, by the light of a candle, did she whisper, "You saw the Americans. Tell me, were they as cruel as we were told?" Hans shook his head. "No, they were everything we wanted to be." Months passed. Germany split into zones. Allies brought food, rebuilt roads, opened schools. And amid the ruins, something fragile began to grow. Not pride, but humility. Many former POWs like Hans became translators, teachers, or local administrators. They were the only Germans who had seen democracy up close, not as theory, but as daily life. Hans found work helping organize food distribution under the U.S. occupation. The same men who'd once guarded him now shook his hand. One American officer recognized him. "Bauer's farm, right? You fixed that tractor." Hans laughed softly. "Yes, sir. Still runs, I hope." The officer smiled. "Still runs." That small exchange, a memory shared instead of a weapon raised, said more than any treaty. Across Germany, ex-POWs became unexpected messengers. They wrote about America's tolerance, its contradictions, its imperfections, and its freedom. A sociologist later noted that nearly 30% of post-war German mayors had once been POWs in the U.S. Many credited those years with reshaping their worldview. Hans wasn't a politician, but his heart had changed in the same way. When he saw mobs demanding revenge, he turned away. When someone spoke of purity and strength, he remembered Bauer's family laughing around a dinner table and realized that real strength was compassion without weakness. In 1953, a letter arrived from Iowa. It was from Karl Bauer. The handwriting was firm, the tone warm. The corn was good this year. I think of you whenever I hear that old tractor coughing to life. You're welcome here anytime. Maybe one day the fences will be gone everywhere." Hans folded the letter, smiling through tears. 2 years later, he managed a visit. He stood again on Bauer's farm, older, quieter, the world at peace. Bauer met him halfway down the path, arms open. No uniforms, no fences. Just two men, once enemies, now bound by something larger than war. They walked the fields together. The air smelled of earth and diesel, exactly as it had a decade earlier. Hans turned to Bauer and said, "You know, back then, I thought you were my captor." Bauer grinned. "And now?" Hans looked at the horizon. "Now I think you're my teacher." The years rolled on. Germany rose again, not through conquest, but cooperation. And woven quietly into that rebirth were the lessons of thousands of men like Hans Richter, who had seen both sides of power and chosen empathy over ego. They never forgot the irony. The greatest blow to Nazi ideology hadn't come from bombs or armies. It came from American farmers with German last names, who won by being decent when cruelty was expected. One cold December evening, long after Bauer had passed, Hans sat by his window in Munich, watching snow fall over a city reborn. He opened his old diary, now yellowed with age. On the final page, he wrote, "History says we lost the war, but the truth is we finally learned how to win." He closed the book and whispered, "Danke, Bauer." The snow kept falling, quiet, forgiving, endless. Empires crumble, but memory endures. If stories like this move you, where enemies became teachers and war turned into wisdom, subscribe for the next untold chapter of World War II history. Because sometimes the deepest victories aren't won on battlefields, they're won in the heart. Autumn 1944, a barbed wire camp in the middle of Iowa. Frost clings to the wire like silver veins. The morning is quiet, broken only by the hum of tractors somewhere beyond the fields. Inside the fence, hundreds of captured German soldiers queue for roll call. Their once proud uniforms now replaced with faded U.S. khaki-marked PW. One of them, Hans Richter, 22 years old, once a tank mechanic for the Afrika Korps, stares past the sentry tower. Beyond the fence, a farmer waves as he drives a tractor through a sea of corn. On his overalls, stitched in blue thread, a name, Muller. Hans freezes. Muller, the same name as his commanding officer back in Tunisia. The same name carved on his family's barn door in Bavaria. But this Muller isn't German. He's American. And free. Hans can't understand it. How could an American farmer, the enemy, carry a German name, speak with a hint of German accent, live in a house bigger than his entire village? What Hans didn't know was that across the United States, more than 425,000 German prisoners were waking up to the same surreal realization, that the enemy they'd been told was decadent, chaotic, and weak, looked and spoke just like them. This isn't just a story about prisoners of war. It's a story about identity, irony, and the collapse of an illusion. When the sons of the Reich found their enemies living the dream they were told only Germans deserved. Under the blistering African sun, German soldiers surrendered by the thousands. The once glorious Afrika Korps, Erwin Rommel's Desert Fox Army, was crushed between British armor and American firepower. Those who survived were herded into makeshift desert enclosures, still proud, still convinced of eventual victory. Among them was Hans. His tank had been hit near Tunis. He'd been captured alongside his crew. When the American jeep pulled up, he expected humiliation. Instead, the soldier offered him a cigarette. "You speak English?" the GI asked. Hans nodded cautiously. "Then you know it's over." Over. That word echoed as they were marched to the coast, loaded on his ships under heavy guard. Hans watched the horizon fade behind him, believing he was being sent to some brutal prison in Britain, or worse, to forced labor in some hellish jungle colony. But the ship didn't turn toward Europe. It kept going west. For weeks, below deck, the prisoners whispered theories. The Americans were taking them to a secret island. Maybe they'd be executed far from witnesses. Instead, one morning, Hans smelled pine. Fresh, cold air. When the hatch opened, the guard shouted, Welcome to America. What followed was a logistical miracle few know today. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States quietly transported more than 425,000 German POWs across the Atlantic, an operation larger than the entire D-Day fleet in tonnage. They were scattered through 700 camps across the American heartland, from Texas to Minnesota. The men were stunned. They had been taught that America was chaotic, full of racial tension, crime, poverty. Yet what they saw through the train windows looked like paradise. Roads paved smooth, farms stretching to the horizon, factories humming day and night. At Camp Polk, Louisiana, the guards handed out hot coffee, clean bedding, and cigarettes. One officer said bluntly, "We treat prisoners as we'd want our boys treated." For Hans, the shock wasn't comfort. It was the realization that their enemy could afford mercy. Inside the camp, the men still marched in step, saluted invisible officers, and sang the songs of the Reich. But the questions had begun. If this is how they treat us, one wrote in his diary, how strong must they be? For every act of kindness, another brick fell from the fortress of Nazi ideology. But pride dies slowly. Hans still believed he would one day go home a hero. He had no idea that America wasn't just a prison. It was a mirror, and what it would show him would change his life forever. The train screeched to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Hans blinked through the grime-streaked window. Outside, endless fields of gold, a town with one church steeple, a grain silo, and not much else. A wooden sign read, "Welcome to Algona, Iowa." This wasn't the America he imagined. No skyscrapers, no jazz clubs, no chaos. Just stillness, and a faint smell of bread baking somewhere in the distance. When the guards opened the doors, sunlight poured in. A U.S. sergeant shouted in German, "Ausrücken, line up." The accent was flawless. Hans froze. The guard wasn't German, but spoke it like a native. Minutes later, they were marched through the town toward the camp. Children peeked from doorways. Some waved shyly. And then, Hans saw it again, a sign on a storefront, Schmidt's Hardware. He turned to another prisoner, whispering, "Do you see that? Schmidt, with a DT at the end. Just like back home." Within days, the Germans learned the truth. Nearly half the people in town had German roots. Names like Muller, Bauer, Schneider, and Fischer filled mailboxes. The irony hit like a hammer. They were prisoners in a land built by people who looked and spoke just like them. Inside the camp, the shock deepened. Instead of beatings, there were warm meals, libraries, even music hours. Every morning, trucks arrived to take groups of POWs to nearby farms. The farmers needed labor, and under the Geneva Convention, POWs could work for pay. Hans was assigned to a corn farm owned by Karl Bauer, another name from the old country. The first day, Bauer greeted him with a smile. "You from Bavaria?" Bauer asked, his accent still tinged with the sound of his grandparents. "Yes," Hans replied cautiously. "From near Augsburg. My family came from there too." 1886, Bauer said, laughing softly. "Looks like we both ended up in the cornfields, huh?" The man handed Hans a sandwich. Thick bread, ham, real butter. Hans hadn't seen butter since North Africa. "You eat. Work after," Bauer said. Hans didn't know how to react. Was this kindness a trick? Or something deeper? A glimpse of what Germany could have been without the war? Every day, his confusion grew. Bauer's house was modest but solid. His children went to school. His wife played piano in the evenings. There were no secret police, no speeches, no fear. Hans wrote in his diary that night, "Their barns are larger than our houses. Their wives walk free, and they laugh, not out of arrogance, but peace." It was the first crack in his certainty. In the evenings, the POWs gathered behind the barbed wire and whispered what they'd seen. Grocery stores filled with food, farmers who owned their own land, workers who joked with their bosses. One said, "They are more German than we are." The others laughed, but not for long, because beneath the laughter was a question no one wanted to say aloud. If this is America, what exactly were we fighting for? But ideology is stubborn. Inside the camp, some men clung tighter to the Reich. Secret groups formed, enforcing loyalty. Anyone who spoke too kindly of Americans was marked defeatist. Some had their hair shaved. Others were beaten at night. Hans stayed quiet. He had seen what happened to those who doubted. Yet the seed of doubt had already taken root. Weeks later, during harvest, Bauer's tractor broke down. Hans, the tank mechanic, offered to help. Together, they worked side by side, sweat, grease, and the smell of diesel mixing in the warm air. When the engine finally roared back to life, Bauer clapped him on the shoulder. "You fix things," he said simply. "Good man." It wasn't praise from a commander. It was gratitude from a human being, and somehow that meant more. That night, Hans looked out from the camp fence and saw Bauer's family at dinner. Warm light glowing from the window, laughter faint through the wind. He thought of his mother, sitting in a darkened house back in Munich, rationing bread under air raids. And he whispered, almost guiltily, "Maybe this is what we wanted all along." But the war was far from over. And as the winter of 1944 approached, the line between enemy and neighbor would blur even further, until the prisoners began to question not just their captors, but their entire belief system. The real battle wasn't on the front anymore. It was inside their minds. The snow came early that year. By December 1944, the cornfields of Iowa stood frozen and silent, a white ocean under the pale sun. Inside the POW camp, the men had built Christmas decorations from scraps of wood and tin. Someone even carved a small wooden angel. Hans Richter sat by the stove, reading a tattered book borrowed from the camp library. On the inside cover, in neat handwriting, it read, "Property of Algona High School." He turned the pages slowly, still not understanding how a prison could have a library, or why his captors would let them borrow American books. Back home, books were burned for wrong thoughts. Here, the guards encouraged them to read. It was strange. Every day, America looked less like the monster he'd been told to fear, and more like the world he secretly wished existed. But outside, beyond the fences, another surprise was waiting. That winter, Hans and a few others were assigned to work daily for Karl Bauer's farm. The trust was remarkable. Unarmed prisoners, driven out of camp in open trucks, working among civilians. Bauer treated them fairly, paid them in tokens redeemable for cigarettes or chocolate, let them eat lunch with his family at the big oak table. One afternoon, Bauer's son, a skinny teenager with bright blue eyes, asked Hans shyly, "Is it true you worked on tanks?" Hans smiled. "Yes, Panzer III. Very strong, very stubborn." The boy's eyes widened. "We have a tractor that's stubborn, too." They laughed. For a moment, the war didn't exist. The days blurred into routine, work, meals, laughter, then back behind barbed wire at dusk. Yet inside the camp, a quieter battle was being fought. Not between nations, but between ideas. Some men, mostly older soldiers, refused to let go of the Reich. They held secret meetings in the barracks, whispering about Hitler's final victory. They painted swastikas on walls, burned letters that praised America, and punished traitors who questioned the cause. At night, Hans could hear arguments through the thin walls. "You think the Americans are our friends? They just want to break us." "They don't need to break us," another replied. "We're doing that ourselves." The camp commandant turned a blind eye, as long as no one caused trouble. But the psychological tension was palpable. One morning, Hans found a leaflet slipped under his bunk. "Never forget who you are. The Führer still fights for us. Do not be deceived by enemy lies." He crumpled it in his hand. Something inside him recoiled, not at the message itself, but at how desperate it sounded. That evening, while repairing a broken farm truck, Bauer asked him a simple question. "Do you ever think about what happens after all this?" Hans hesitated. "I go home, if there's still a home." Bauer nodded slowly. "You'll rebuild. You people are good at that. So are we." The man looked out across his field, acres of corn sleeping under snow. "You know," he added softly, "my grandfather left Germany because he wanted to be free, to farm his own land. No one telling him what to grow, what to think, who to salute." Hans said nothing. The words hit deeper than any speech or pamphlet ever could. That night, lying on his bunk, he whispered to himself, "If America can have freedom without chaos, were we wrong all along?" As winter deepened, News began to filter into the camp. Whispers of Allied troops crossing the Rhine. Photos of destroyed German cities. Letters describing families hiding in basements, food running out, hope fading. Some men laughed it off. Propaganda. Others, like Hans, stared into the fire, silent. He could no longer reconcile the image of his homeland's glory with what he saw here. Discipline without oppression, strength without cruelty. The contradiction haunted him. One evening, a fellow POW named Dieter approached him. Dieter had once been a party youth leader, fanatically loyal. But now his eyes were tired. "You think we've been lied to, don't you?" he asked quietly. Hans didn't answer. Dieter smiled sadly. "Me too." He looked toward the distant lights of town. Maybe the real Germany survived here. The next morning, Hans awoke to shouting. A fellow prisoner, a man named Vogel, had been beaten overnight for sympathizing with the enemy. He'd written a letter praising the Americans' fairness. The Nazi loyalists called him a traitor. When the guards found him, his nose was broken, his uniform torn. Hans helped carry him to the infirmary. The American medic didn't ask what happened. He just patched the man up quietly, bandaged his wounds, and handed him water. Vogel whispered through cracked lips, "They call me weak. But maybe strength isn't what we thought it was." That sentence stuck with Hans for days. Strength wasn't about domination. It was about dignity, the kind he saw in the farmer who shared his bread, in the guard who spoke kindly, in the medic who helped without hate. Weeks later, as the snow began to melt, Bauer invited Hans to church for Easter service through the fence. "You can't come inside," he said, "but maybe you'd like to hear the singing." So Hans stood behind the wire, listening as the voices carried through the cold morning air. Families gathered. Children laughed. The hymns were the same ones he'd heard as a boy in Bavaria. He whispered the words under his breath. Same God, same language, different worlds. In that moment, the war felt impossibly small. The enemy didn't look like monsters anymore. They looked like cousins, reflections, and the mirrors stared back. But peace never comes easily. Rumors began swirling. The Reich collapsing, Allied bombers flattening cities, Hitler's voice growing desperate on the radio. Hans knew what it meant. The war was ending. But what kind of home would he return to? Would Germany still exist? Would his family even be alive? He didn't have answers. Only a growing certainty that everything he believed about his country, his enemies, and himself was about to shatter. Spring 1945. Rain swept across the camp roofs, streaking the tin with long silver scars. For the first time in months, Hans Richter was allowed to write a letter home. The paper was thin, stamped, censored. Every word he wrote would be read, translated, and redacted before it ever touched German soil. Still, it was a lifeline, a thread stretched across an ocean of uncertainty. He stared at the blank page for a long time before the words came. "Dear Mother, I'm safe. The Americans treat us well. We work, we eat, we live. But I do not know what remains of home." He hesitated. Should he say what he really thought? That the enemy wasn't cruel? That the fields here were full of laughter? That the people spoke German names with pride, not fear? He stopped writing. If he said too much, the letter would never pass. If he said too little, his mother would think he was suffering. So he wrote only this: "I hope someday you see what I've seen. Then you will understand." Across America, thousands of similar letters were being written by German prisoners. Men who had once sworn to die for Hitler, now describing their captors with admiration. The U.S. Censor's office flagged hundreds as suspiciously positive. One read, "If only our people knew how these Americans live, they would stop fighting tomorrow." The Gestapo in Germany intercepted many of them, labeling them defeatist propaganda. Some family members were questioned. Others disappeared. Still, the letters kept coming. Hans wasn't the same man he'd been in North Africa. His uniform was long gone, his medal stripped. But dignity, that strange, quiet kind, had grown back in its place. Each morning he walked to Bauer's farm, the muddy road framed by budding trees. Sometimes he'd pass local boys his age on bicycles, free, smiling, untouched by war. He couldn't hate them anymore. He envied them. That summer, news reached the camp that Hitler was dead. The announcement came through a crackling radio in the command tent. The guard turned down the volume, whispered, "It's over." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, for the far side of the yard, a German voice shouted, "Luge! Lies!" But deep down, they all knew. The Reich was gone. Some prisoners cheered quietly, relieved. Others wept. A few swore vengeance, even in defeat. Hans felt only emptiness. He thought of his father, a schoolteacher who'd joined the party to keep his job. He thought of his mother, her letters growing shorter, her handwriting shakier. And he wondered what was left of the world he'd been told was eternal. Over the following weeks, the camp's mood shifted. American guards grew more relaxed. Fences felt less like walls and more like boundaries of routine. Farmers like Bauer visited with gifts, apples, books, small radios. One day, Bauer brought a letter. "For you," he said. Hans unfolded it carefully. His mother's writing was faint, the ink blurred. "We are alive," she wrote. "Munich is mostly gone. Your sister works in a soup kitchen. We pray for peace." At the bottom, she'd added one more line. "You say they treat you kindly. Then learn from them, my son. Bring that kindness home." Hans folded the letter slowly. He'd never realized words could weigh more than bullets. As weeks turned to months, more news filtered in. Images of liberated camps, photographs of skeletal survivors, stories of horrors committed in the name of the Reich. The prisoners stared at the smuggled newspapers in stunned silence. "How could this be true?" one man whispered. Another muttered, "It's enemy propaganda." But Hans couldn't look away. He remembered the leaflets, the speeches, the pride. And now, he felt it collapsing. Not just the Reich, but the story of who they were supposed to be. He thought of Bauer's children laughing in the fields, and then of the dead children in the photographs. Two worlds, same species. One chose life, the other obedience.